Introduction to James. Author and title. The title of this book derives from the name of its author, James the Just, as he was called, the brother of Jesus. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary, and aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon and Judas? Matthew chapter 13 verse 55. And a key leader of the early Jerusalem church. See Acts chapter 15. There is general consensus regarding his authorship, although some have challenged this on the grounds that 1. The Greek is too polished and the rhetoric too Hellenistic for someone who never left Judea. 2. The author never refers to himself as Jesus' brother. 3. The author seems to be interacting with Pauline issues on faith and works, justification and freedom, and so had to write much later than James could have written, since he was executed in AD 62. There is no good reason, however, to deny that James is the author. As scholars now recognize, there was substantial contact between Jews and Gentiles on a professional but not social level, especially in Galilee, where James grew up. Also, the region had been Hellenized since the time of Alexander the Great. Moreover, James was not reacting to Pauline issues, but rather addressing similar themes in his own church. It is not possible that he is addressing a misunderstanding of Paul's teaching, as he wrote in the early 40s AD, before Paul started his ministry in Antioch, and the earliest letter we have of Paul is Galatians, which most hold that he wrote in AD 48. Therefore, James is writing so early that he could have no knowledge of any of Paul's letters. There are a couple of accounts of the martyrdom of James, but many hold to that given by 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, who writes that, following the death of the Roman governor of Judea, Porcius Festus, in AD 62, the high priest Ananus gathered the Sanhedrin, accused James of violating the law along with some others, and had them all stoned. As a consequence, the new governor, Lucius Albinus, removed Ananus from the position of high priest upon his arrival. The historicity of James is well attested to in historical literature, e.g. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities 20, 200-201, Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History 2.23. Date. Since James died in AD 62, the letter had to precede that date. Further, if this had been written after the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem, AD 48-49, it surely would have mentioned the issues from that momentous occasion. Thus the letter was most likely written in the early to mid-40s. Theme. James' primary theme is living out one's faith, being a doer and not just a hearer of the word. This theme is developed in view of the social conflict between rich and poor, and the spiritual conflict between factions in the church. James rebukes his readers for their worldliness and challenges them to seek divine wisdom in working out these problems in order to be right before God. Purpose of James. The audience of James' letter is almost certainly Jewish Christians, as evidenced by the designation, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, James chapter 1 verse 1b, and your meeting or assembly, Greek synagogue, in James chapter 2 verse 2, the Jewish reasoning throughout, and James' frequent reflection on the Mosaic law. If the scattering or dispersion in some translations is literal, as well as metaphorical, then these are a group of Jewish Christian house churches outside of Judea, which fits the situation of persecution and poverty in the letter. More than that cannot be said, but the social situation can be gleaned from the letter. As a result of the troubles, conflict had entered the churches, and they have splintered into fighting factions. Moreover, some have fallen into worldly lifestyle. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. James chapter 1 verse 27. And, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred toward God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. James chapter 4 verse 4. And have failed to put their faith into practice. Dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Therefore get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word, and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror and, after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom, and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. If anyone considers himself religious, and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. James chapter 1 verses 19 to 26. With the result that he is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does. James chapter 1 verse 8. They are wavering between God and the world. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. James chapter 4 verse 8. Salvation history. Since Christ has accomplished salvation, believers are to hold fast to him and reject false ways. They are called to remember that there is only one route into eternal salvation. Writing style. Even though James begins with an epistolary salutation, the rest of the book does not have the format of an epistle, but rather is a collection of wisdom sayings, much like the genre of wisdom literature as seen in the Old Testament. The generic format of that wisdom literature is the collection of Proverbs. Additionally, the book of James belongs to the ancient Greek form of satire known as a diatribe, the traits of which include imaginary dialogues, including question and answer constructions, apostrophe, direct address to absent people or things as though they were present and can hear, metaphors taken from nature and everyday life, allusions to famous people from the past, i.e. stock instances or well-known representations of the qualities that are under discussion, harsh addresses of readers, and heightened contrasts. The most pervasive technique in the book of James is the proverb or aphorism, in the mode of ancient wisdom teachers. Next in frequency is the rhetorical device of direct command, expressed in the imperative mood of the verb, e.g. to be doers rather than hearers of the word, as in James chapter 1 verse 22. In fact, there are over 50 imperatives in the book's 108 verses. This abundance of commands is a signal that the writer has a practical bent and is interested in action rather than mere belief as the distinguishing characteristic of Christians. There is also a strongly persuasive stance as the author seeks to move his readers to action. The tone is continuously energetic, and satire is never far from the surface, sometimes couched in a somewhat scolding manner. Key themes. 1. God is seen as a gracious giver, the unchanging creator, merciful and compassionate, a judge, the one and only God, a jealous God, a gracious God, and a healing God. 2. Wisdom comes from above, enabling a believer both to withstand trials and to bring peace rather than discord. 3. God allows tests and trials, but temptation does not come from God, but from self and Satan. The required response is patient endurance. 4. The primary trial is poverty and oppression from the rich. The poor are the special focus of God's care and must be cared for by his people without showing prejudice and not being ignored. The wealthy are condemned for presumptuous pride and for stealing from the poor. 5. Apocalyptic themes are prevalent in terms of both future judgment and reward. 6. The power of the tongue to destroy and to bring peace dominates the middle section. 7. The ethical mandate to go beyond hearing the word to living it out in daily conduct is made explicit early on and is implicit throughout the letter. 8. Prayer is the proper response to trials, but it must not be self-seeking. It is to be central in life, not only when afflicted or sick, but also when cheerful. God has great power to heal, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. 9. Faith in its relationship to both works and justification does not contradict but supplements Paul's teaching. James and Paul are united in teaching that justification comes only by the grace of God, through faith, but will of necessity result in works. If there are no resultant works, there was no justification in the first place. The setting of James, circa AD 40 to 45. The Epistle of James was likely written to predominantly Jewish Christian house churches outside of Judea, based on it being sent to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, James chapter 1 verse 1b, its distinctly Jewish content and its focus on persecution and poverty. This would mean it was sent throughout most of the ancient Mediterranean world. See the image. The image shows the region at the time James wrote his letter. Outline. James did not write in the accepted style of New Testament epistles, but more in the way of a collection of wisdom sayings to address, using forceful language, a number of issues of concern in these early church groups. For the purposes of study, the letter breaks down into 8 major sections. James chapter 1 verse 1, Greeting. James identifies himself as the Lord's servant and his intended readership as probably Jewish Christians, with perhaps some Gentile Christians that had come to faith via Judaism. James chapter 1 verses 2 to 18, Trials and Temptations. James advises that all believers will face trials in their life that are intended to strengthen their perseverance in the faith. He also warns them not to weaken in their faith by being drawn into sin by the lures of the world. James chapter 1 verses 19 to 27, Listening and Doing. James is a great proponent of not merely being hearers but doers of the word. By carefully listening and not reacting inappropriately, keeping their tongues in check, the believer is less likely to respond in an unacceptable way. James chapter 2 verses 1 to 13, Favoritism Forbidden. James wants his readers to understand that accepting someone based on their social status in the world is unacceptable. It doesn't matter how rich or poor a person is, they are equal in the eyes of God and should be treated with genuine equality. James chapter 2 verses 14 to 26, Faith and Deeds. James advises his readers to demonstrate their faith through an outworking of their faith by the works they do. By this he is not advocating that salvation is by works but by faith. However, a natural outworking of that faith is seen in the resulting deeds in a believer's life. James chapter 3 verse 1 to James chapter 4 verse 12, The sin of dissension in the community. In terms of its length, this is the major section in the letter, and it addresses the danger of the tongue, and that wisdom to tame it came from above and leads to peace, while the wisdom to use it unwisely is of the devil and leads to disorder. The section closes by showing just how bad some of the behavior in churches had become as different factions were fighting for doctrinal control. James chapter 4 verse 13 to James chapter 5 verse 12, The sins of the wealthy. James condemns the sins of the wealthy, their arrogant presumption and robbing the poor. He addresses his concerns firstly to wealthy businessmen, before turning on the big landowners who were subjecting the poor to total servitude. He then issues a call to all believers for patience in suffering. James chapter 5 verses 13 to 20, The prayer of faith. Speaking mainly of prayer, James restates some of the letter's key themes, including trials and misuse of the tongue. The ultimate way to tame one's tongue is to pray for each other. Luther on James. Luther did not consider James' letter to be apostolic, as it does not major on the resurrection, which is central to the gospel of Christ. These are well-known views of Luther in regard to the Epistle of James, and the grounds upon which he rejected it from the canon of the New Testament are presented in his comments on 1 Peter. He was too impatient of the seeming contradiction between Paul and James upon the subject of faith, and too hastily concluded that they were irreconcilable. A careful consideration of the scope of the argument in the Epistle of James removes the difficulty, as may be seen at large by later commentators. There is no historical reason for casting discredit upon the Epistle of James. The early Christian writers furnish very decided testimony in its favour. Clement of Rome has alluded to it twice. Hermas has no less than 7 allusions to it, which according to Lardner is fully sufficient to prove its antiquity. Origen, Jerome, Athanasius, and most of the subsequent ecclesiastical writers quote from it, and it is found in all the catalogues of canonical books published by the general and provincial councils. But an argument of still greater weight is the fact that it is inserted in the Syriac version of the New Testament, executed at the close of the 1st or early 2nd century. None certainly would question that the mainly Jewish believers to whom it was addressed would be the best judges of its genuine and authentic nature, and by them it was unhesitatingly accepted. Introduction to James. Ends.